Good day. It's Monday, July 14th, 2025. I'm Rory Mack, and this is your Daily World Brief. Today we start in North America, where trade policy jitters are looming over the economy. The US is gearing up to slap hefty new tariffs on major trading partners. We're talking up to 35% duties on imports from places like the EU, Canada, and Mexico, set to kick in August. These tariffs act like an extra sales tax on imported goods, and economists say they could finally push US inflation higher after a period of relative calm. In fact, the upcoming Consumer Price Index report for June is expected to show one of the largest jumps since President Trump's tariff hikes began. Early forecasts point to about a 0.3% rise in prices for the month, nudging annual inflation closer to 3%, a sign that the trade war may be starting to hit shoppers' wallets. So what does that mean for the Federal Reserve? Essentially, it's complicating their job. The Fed has been hinting at possible interest rate cuts to support growth, but tariff-driven inflation is throwing a wrench in the works. Just last month, Fed officials decided unanimously to hold interest rates steady at about 4.25% instead of cutting. Why? Because they saw this summer's inflation creeping up due to the new tariffs. In plain English, the Fed is in wait-and-see mode. They want to make sure any price spikes from tariffs are temporary before easing up on interest rates. Some Fed watchers think a rate cut might come as soon as September if the economy slows, but others say that won't happen unless it's clear the tariff-induced price boosts are under control. For now, the central bank is signaling caution. Trade uncertainty is high, inflation might tick up, and that means holding off on stimulus. In short, the US trade battles are becoming a wild card for inflation and Fed policy, keeping markets on edge. Shifting over to Europe, there are two big stories, one economic, one military. Economic jitters, ECB braces for tariffs. The European Central Bank is nervously eyeing Washington's tariff threats. With the US poised to impose a 30% import tax on EU goods, Europe's economy could face a serious blow. The ECB has already cut interest rates 8 times in the past year as inflation cooled off to about 2%, and growth in the Eurozone has been sluggish. Now, the risk of a transatlantic trade war adds even more uncertainty. Higher US tariffs would likely hurt European exports. Germany, for example, is warning a 30% US tariff could hit its export industry to the core. Oddly enough, some analysts say this could push European inflation down even further by redirecting cheap Chinese goods to Europe that can't go to the US market. Lower demand and cheaper imports mean less price pressure. So the ECB is expected to stay in dove mode, keeping rates low or even ready to cut again to support the economy if needed. It paused rate cuts in July to take stock after those 8 reductions, but officials have made clear they'll follow a data-dependent, meeting-by-meeting approach given the exceptional uncertainty. On the upside, Europe's governments are ramping up spending on defense and infrastructure, which the ECB notes could help offset the trade drag over time. In sum, Europe's central bankers are on alert. If the US goes through with punitive tariffs, expect the ECB to respond with a supportive policy stance to keep the Eurozone on track. NATO arms for Ukraine. On the security front, NATO and the US have struck a noteworthy deal to arm Ukraine. At a recent summit, President Trump took a victory lap announcing that NATO allies agreed to purchase American-made weapons systems for Ukraine's defense. This is seen as a way to boost Ukraine's firepower against Russia without directly draining US coffers. Under the deal, NATO's procurement agency will coordinate buying US weapons, including advanced Patriot air defense missile batteries, and sending them to Ukraine. In fact, Trump claimed these Patriot systems could arrive within days and emphatically noted, "They are paying for everything. We're not paying anymore." European members are essentially footing the bill, which Trump touted as a win after long urging Europe to spend more on defense. A top German military official has confirmed Berlin was in talks to purchase a US Patriot battery for Ukraine. By using NATO as the coordinator, this arrangement streamlines the process. NATO countries either buy directly from the US or pool resources via the alliance to get these weapons where they are needed. For Ukraine, it means critical gear like air defenses and potentially long-range weapons on the way. And for NATO, it shows unity with the US in backing Kiev, even as Russia's war drags on. The take-home message: Europe is stepping up to arm Ukraine, sharing more of the financial burden, which in turn keeps the transatlantic alliance solid, and Washington happier, in the effort to deter Russia. Moving to the Asia-Pacific, tensions between China and Taiwan are on full display through dueling military exercises in the Western Pacific over the last 24 hours. Taiwan's biggest war games. Taiwan has launched its largest ever military drills, the 10-day continuous exercise known as Hanquang. Starting Wednesday, the Taiwanese armed forces began round-the-clock live fire maneuvers aimed at bolstering defenses against a potential invasion from China. These annual war games are longer and more intense than in years past, complete with new hardware like American-made Abrams tanks and HIMARS rocket systems in action. The drills simulate all sorts of scenarios, from repelling amphibious landings to countering gray zone tactics, like harassment by Chinese maritime militia around Taiwan's outlying islands. Taiwan's government says they are learning lessons from the war in Ukraine and preparing, realistically, for what a conflict with China might entail. They even brought in 22,000 reservists to augment regular troops. Beijing's show of force, not to be outdone, China responded with its own military muscle around Taiwan almost immediately. Within hours of Taiwan's drill kickoff, Taiwan's defense ministry spotted 31 Chinese warplanes and 7 naval vessels operating nearby, with 24 of those aircraft crossing the unofficial median line in the Taiwan Strait. Essentially, the PLA, People's Liberation Army, staged its own combat readiness patrols encircling the island, which Taipei blasted as harassment. Beijing's message was loud and clear, a stern warning against any form of Taiwanese independence. A Chinese defense spokesperson dismissed Taiwan's exercise as nothing but a bluffing and self-deceiving trick by the island's leaders. Alongside the saber-rattling, China also announced export controls on several Taiwanese defense firms involved in making missiles and drones, in retaliation for the war games and Taipei's military ties with the US. It's a dramatic tit for tat. Taiwan is drilling to show it won't be an easy target, and China is flying bombers and sailing an aircraft carrier nearby to remind Taipei, and perhaps the US, of its own capabilities. The region is on edge as these parallel exercises play out. Allies like the US and Japan are keeping a close watch, urging calm. But for now, the skies and seas around Taiwan are very busy, underscoring just how high tensions have become in the Pacific. The tone in Taipei is resolute. These exercises are meant to show both the Taiwanese public and the world that Taiwan can and will defend itself if threatened. Lastly, let's head to the Middle East. The Syrian Druze are under attack. In Syria's Swayda province, home to the country's Druze minority, heavy fighting has erupted between local Druze militias and forces allied with the Syrian government. Over the past few days, clashes broke out after a bitter feud between Druze villagers and neighboring Bedouin tribes escalated violently. Syrian government troops were sent in to restore order, but instead they also ended up in firefights with the Druze fighters. The result has been deadly. Dozens have been killed in the chaos. Syria's Interior Ministry reported at least 30 deaths and 100 injuries, while independent monitors say the toll is even higher. This is a remarkable development because the Druze community in Syria had mostly stayed on the sidelines of the civil war. But with sectarian tensions boiling over and government forces now clashing with the Druze, it marks a new chapter of bloodshed. The violence in Swayda underscores the fragile state of Syria after 14 years of conflict. Notably, Syria is under new leadership since former President Bashar al-Assad fled the country late last year amid a rebel offensive, and the Druze have been wary of the new authorities in Damascus as well. Now that fighting has reached these typically quiet Druze areas, alarms are ringing beyond Syria's borders. Israeli intervention. Israel is actively responding to protect the Druze, a community that spans the Syria-Israel frontier. In a rare move, the Israeli army carried out airstrikes in southern Syria, taking out at least 2 Syrian tanks that were shelling Druze towns. Israel has long considered the Druze a vulnerable minority and has promised not to sit by if they are in peril. In fact, this is the second time in recent months Israel has struck in Syria over Druze safety. Back in May, Israeli forces fired missiles near Damascus after reports of a massacre of Druze civilians. At that time, Israel's leadership publicly warned Syria's interim government, saying Israel will not allow the deployment of Syrian forces south of Damascus or any threat to the Druze community. Those words are now backed up by action. By hitting Syrian military targets, Israel is signaling to Damascus, hands off the Druze. The Druze people have a unique significance for Israel. Many Druze also live in northern Israel and the Golan Heights, and even serve in the IDF, creating a sense of kinship. Prime Minister Netanyahu made it clear that Israel won't tolerate a slaughter of Druze on its doorstep. The situation is still unfolding, but Israel's intervention raises the stakes. It's a reminder that Syria's civil strife can quickly draw in neighbors. All eyes are on whether the Syrian forces will pull back and de-escalate, or if this flashpoint grows. For now, the Druze community's plight has the full attention of Israel, which is poised to strike again if the threat continues. That's it for today's World Briefing. I'm Rory Mack. Stay informed, stay stead, and I'll see you tomorrow.